This is the GH9, the Global Health 9 class in the Brazil module. And the idea behind this class is that we assume that you are a group of motivated persons that are doing a great effort traveling the world, knowing about health issues around the world, but someday you will be the leaders in global health cooperation. So we propose you to have a moment of reflection and to think about how countries can cooperate, or if they are really just competitors. The other question is, we can do cooperation and at the same time do no harm, which is a principle of goodwill. Let's first do no harm. And also, how are the facets of global health cooperation? Some of them are pure goodwill, some of them are economically motivated, some of them are just another way of one country exerting power over the other. After you see this presentation and the video at the end, we will have a discussion. We will select 4 of you that will discuss, and we will sit around the 4 debaters, and we will take the questions at one of the last slides as a guide for discussion. These are 2 big issues. Is this cooperation is good or bad? And what's happening in the world today in this area? So hope you enjoy, and go ahead, and we will see you in class. So, which are this cooperation and globalization as patterns of world relationships? Maybe they're like the emergent patterns of a new evolution, a dynamic that is going to progress in the future. Because actually, inter-country cooperation in health, even though it has historical roots, in its present form has less than 60 years. We don't know how this will evolve in the future due to the growing nationalism and isolation of countries.
So in this session we need to ask ourselves, and then we will discuss in class why we cooperate with each other, and this is important in the video that you will see at the end, and an extension how we cooperate with each other, with our city, with our neighbors, with the country, with the other countries in the planet. This kind of evolution. How can cooperation and solidarity evolve, and we can ask ourselves what is going to happen in the future? How cooperation in health begin to be a part of the global arena of diplomacy, and why? And a critical look at cooperation stakeholders. The first question that we are going to discuss is why we cooperate. There's a old theory, people repeat this, that the evolution is the survival of the fittest. It's like we are in struggle all with each other. It originated in Darwin theories, and it was completely misunderstood. The idea of Darwin is that we evolve and we survive as a species, collectively. And this was also confirmed by Edward Wilson in a great work called The Social Conquest of Earth, that demonstrated how species collectively can work better and be more successful. As you will see in the video of RSA Animate, as the field of vision of human, the comprehension of the world of human began to expand from the small group of the tribe to present-day planetary awareness, the empathy gained new shape. So reciprocity, solidarity, and cooperation began to evolve in a more wider scale. and this may have something to do with the opposition or the differences between being altruist and being self-interested. So in this discussion about why do we cooperate among us, among our neighbors, and among nations, we need to remember that in the 19th century, Karl von Clausewitz, great diplomat of the time, said that the war is the continuation of diplomacy by other means, and in the 20th century, Zhou Enlai, Chinese premier, said that diplomacy is the continuation of war by other means, so reversed the phrase, but both were saying that war and diplomacy, war and international relationships were basically the same, depending on the circumstances. And so we need to discuss and think about what is reciprocity. Are we cooperating because of solidarity, because we feel that we need to cooperate, or because of reciprocity? I cooperate with you because I expect you to cooperate with me. And to think if this is all the same. Has profound implications in the relations inter-countries. And the next question and the future question is there a continuous process towards more international solidarity? And this has to do with the video that you will see at the end, because we are not sure of this. We are not sure if we progressed from the fight among tribes to our, let's say, basically peaceful world. And we are not sure if this will happen in the future. There is a long history in terms of how cooperation in health has been evolved both from the states, from the countries, and from private initiatives. In the 19th century, in the beginning of the 19th century, Spain created a sanitary mission. You can check it on Google because it's very interesting. It's called Balmis Salvanis. That was a group of ships, a fleet of ships that went from colony to colony with children infected with smallpox that were used to replicate the virus and to have fresh virus to vaccinate people in the colonies. The beginning of the 20th century, rich American industrialists, sometimes what they called robber barons, so people that make money through illegal means, became very rich with the oil industry, the iron industry, and they began to put money to wash their image in international health. So basically, J.D. Rockefeller from the oil industry began a tradition that was closely followed by W.K. Kellogg and Henry Ford, very important foundations that are still working, and in the last 20 years, Bill and Melinda Gates and H. Wellcome, that is from the pharmaceutical industry, are using the same approach. This is called philanthrocapitalism. This kind of combination of philanthropy and capitalism is based in the idea of using business approach to help saving lives in the third world. During the World War II, so let's say in the middle of the 20th century, the past century, United States and Rockefeller Foundation and others created many initiatives, and they really were helpful in expanding public health in Latin America and in other continents, but especially in Latin America. And it was increased during the Cold War, during the 1950s, 70s, even at the 80s, as an intent to expand the goodwill neighborhood of the Americas in confronting the expansion of communism. Also in Africa and Asia, during the 60s, there was what it was called the decolonization period, and this promoted the transformation of departments of tropical medicine in many European countries, evolved into cooperation in health, as well as same happened in other areas. And this created this idea that the countries were helping their own colonies in order to protect perhaps their own investments in those countries. So even if the United Nations was the hotbed, was the place where most treaties and agreements were created, then in the following years, many associations, many regional blocs, many kinds of agreements, beginning with the European Union, the South American Union, Central America, NAFTA, North American Free Trade Association, East Africa, West Africa, the Pacific, they are all creating their own agreements that you can see in a certain way graphically in this picture, but at the same time, there are also health standards, health cooperation agreements that are inserted in all these kind of inter-country agreements, and this all oftentimes overlap. Sometimes they are contradictory. One of them creates one kind of agreement, the other is contradictory with that. This has a lot to do with patents for drugs. This has a lot to do with movement of professionals, of doctors and nurses. So there are, we need to map, and especially in the future, how these trade agreements and inter-country agreements will influence health. After this Second World War, there was the beginning of what is called now the United Nations, and this created an ecosystem for international cooperation, something like a ecological place where countries met and get together in international initiatives. The basis of the United Nations was peace, was to stop the wars, but it was rapidly transformed into cooperation for development. This idea that you will have peace only if poverty is eliminated, only if development is achieved, only if countries are in a better shape. So the United Nations began an era of democracy of nation states, where the cooperation agenda was decided under a principle: one country, one vote. In a certain way, they translated the idea of democracy, one man, one vote, to the nations, like putting, let's say, the small island in the Pacific and China in the same foot, so they can decide together what is better for the collective good. The principle of one country, one vote, that is like a principle of democracy, was not applied in the financial area of the United Nations agencies, like the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank, that they have a mix of capital owners and country votes. So the financing, for instance, the country cooperation in health in the United Nations, which is called the World Health Organization, all the countries have the same right to vote and to decide. If the health cooperation is done by the World Bank, then there will be a much more important influence of the countries that have more capital in that bank. So this is a little bit not such as democracy, but as imposition from one country to the other. After the end of the Cold War, after the end, like in the 90s, in the 1990s, most donor countries were less prone to obey these multilateral agendas, and they began to impose country-specific priorities. And actually, most of the funding of the international UN-type organization is now decided by country agencies and private foundations. And if you would like to check that link that is at the end of the slide, you will see how studying the global development network, many countries, many poor countries give more money to rich countries than what they receive from aid from the rich countries. For instance, in 2012, that is the last year that we have recorded data, developing countries received a total of $1.3 trillion that include all aid, investment, and income from abroad. But in that same year, some $3.3 trillion flowed out of them. In other words, developing countries send $2 trillion more to the rest of the country than what they received. If we look at all years since 1980s, these net outflows add up to a eye-popping total of $16.3 trillion. So that's how much money has been drained out of the global south over the past few decades. So for our discussion, and after you watch the video that is in the next slide, we would like to analyze the following statements. First is, perhaps international cooperation will help my country or my firm or my company for being dominant in the world. The other is, perhaps international cooperation may do more harm than good. The second part of the discussion is that more countries are saying or shouting, America first!
Nekünk Magyarország az első.
Nekünk Magyarországon első. Hungary first. Brazil acima de tudo. Brazil above everyone. So what does it mean for the world? And this is the kind of conflicting visions for the future. Are we heading for a world that is more connected, more cooperative, more solidarity among countries, or we are creating a world with nations that are isolating one from the other? And what does this mean for the world and for the international health?